The city of Miami remembers her like a nightmare that never fully wakes. A woman who smiled in the courtroom as bodies stacked in the streets. A shadow that moved through the cocaine wars with a Bible in one hand and a .380 in the other. They called her the Cocaine Godmother. But long before she became one of the deadliest figures in cartel history, before the assassins on motorcycles and the blood-soaked highways, she was just a girl in Medellín, learning early that mercy was something the world would not give her. And she never gave it back. But first, like, share, and subscribe.
They say that Medellín raised survivors, not children. By the time Griselda Blanco could spell her name, she'd already learned that hunger was a louder teacher than fear. The narrow alleys of her neighborhood smelled of cheap liquor, old bread, and the kind of desperation that made people gamble with their own souls. She watched drunks slump against cracked walls, watched mothers chase their children not with affection but with frustration, watched men disappear into the night and never come back, not because they left, but because they failed to pay someone they owed. Her mother worked as a sex worker, often disappearing for days, then returning home with a fresh bruise and a jaw clenched too tightly for conversation. Griselda remembered lying awake at night, staring at the warped ceiling, listening to strangers come and go. Her mother said nothing about it. Silence became a language in that house. One summer day, when Griselda was just a girl, she and two older boys kidnapped the son of a wealthy landowner. The plan was childish and careless. The boys wanted ransom money, she wanted to escape. But things spiraled. When the child refused to stop screaming, one of the boys slapped him. When he still screamed, Griselda picked up a pistol the boys had stolen earlier that week. She didn't hesitate. The sound echoed through the trees, startling the birds. She walked home slowly, dust gathering on her shoes, expression blank. No one ever connected her to the crime. Medellín swallowed its secrets whole. That was the moment the city learned something about the girl it had raised. She was missing the fear everyone else carried, like a second skin. By her teens, Griselda was running with small-time bandits, men twice her age who learned quickly not to underestimate her. She carried a gun tucked inside her boot, and when one man tried to intimidate her into giving up her share of a robbery, she pulled the trigger before he finished his sentence. She didn't run. She stood over his body as the others stared, then calmly reached into his pockets and took her money back. "Anyone else?" she asked, her voice steady. No one answered. Eventually, she married a forger named Carlos Trujillo. Their marriage wasn't built on love, it was built on mutual need. Carlos made fake immigration papers, and Griselda had ambitions far bigger than the city that birthed her. They began trafficking small amounts of cocaine into the United States, first through couriers, then through a network of desperate women who hid packets inside their clothing. Griselda trained them personally, showing them how to swallow balloons of drugs, how to lie without blinking, how to stand still even when customs officers circled like dogs sniffing at a wound. One night, while sitting inside a dim cantina, lit only by candles, Griselda leaned across the table toward one of her couriers, a girl barely 18. "Do you know the difference between boldness and stupidity?" she asked. The girl shook her head. "Boldness gets you paid. Stupidity gets you buried." The girl nodded quickly, eyes wide. But Griselda didn't smile. She rarely did. By her mid-20s, she had children of her own. 3 sons she dragged with her from safe house to safe house like pieces of luggage she couldn't afford to lose. The boys learned early to sleep lightly and react quickly. Gunfire was as common as thunderstorms. Her marriage deteriorated as Carlos grew jealous of her increasing power. Friends whispered that he'd try to take control of their operation. Others said he feared her, the way a man fears something he cannot predict. Whatever the reason, Carlos didn't live long enough to resolve it. He was killed under mysterious circumstances. People whispered. Griselda stayed silent. She remarried again, this time to a trafficker named Alberto Bravo. He was smoother, more calculated, someone who knew the business inside and out. With his help, Griselda expanded the operation, moving deeper into the cocaine trade at a time when the drug was beginning its meteoric rise in the United States. She studied markets like a stockbroker, studied human nature like a sociologist, and studied violence like a surgeon. And she perfected all 3. In the 1970s, Griselda made her move to the United States. She entered New York like a storm cloud, settling in Queens under the false identity provided by her late husband's forgery business. The city was chaotic, loud, and indifferent. It suited her perfectly. She established a distribution network that grew shockingly quickly. Women carried cocaine inside fake pregnancy bellies or corsets with hidden pockets. Men carried it in hollowed-out shoes. Children were used too, something that horrified even other criminals. But Griselda believed in one principle above all: inventory must move. She didn't care how. At the height of her early operations, she was importing hundreds of kilos, making millions. Her contacts in Colombia trusted her because she sent money back on time and in full. Her enemies in New York feared her because she killed fast and without remorse. And the authorities? They didn't even know her name yet. But that would change. One evening, as snow drifted lazily across the yellow glow of street lamps, a DEA agent named Bill Jensen sat in his unmarked car outside a dingy apartment building in Queens. He was surveilling a suspected cocaine stash house. Around midnight, a woman brushed past him, wearing a long coat, sunglasses, and scarf despite the cold. She moved with an unusual calm. "That her?" whispered another agent in the passenger seat. Jensen shrugged. Could be nothing. They didn't know it yet, but they had just watched the future Queenpin walk past them, unaware of the storm she would unleash. By the late 1970s, federal agents began noticing her trail, the sudden spikes in cocaine distribution, the string of bodies appearing in alleys and parking lots, the pattern of couriers who vanished after making mistakes. Rumors circulated of a woman at the center of it all. They didn't know her name, but they whispered it anyway. La Madrina. The Godmother. Inside a cramped apartment in Queens, Griselda sat at her kitchen table, her hair tied back, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. She was studying a map of Miami. Cocaine demand was exploding there. The money was bigger. The competition was weaker. The violence, that was merely an occupational cost. "Miami is next," she said, tapping her finger against the map. Alberto Bravo frowned. "It's dangerous." "So am I." She picked up her cigarette and walked to the window, staring down at the city. The snow kept falling, coating the streets like a blanket over secrets. She smiled faintly, not out of joy, but out of certainty. Miami wasn't ready for her. But she was ready for Miami. The move to Florida would change everything. For the city, for the cartel world, for the families who lived in the shadows of her empire, and for the woman whose reputation would soon be written in blood. Miami has always been a city between extremes, sunshine and violence, paradise and decay. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it became something else entirely. A feeding ground, a battleground, a place where the cocaine trade transformed from a criminal enterprise into an empire. And at the center of it all stood Griselda Blanco. She didn't arrive quietly. Drug lords rarely do. But Griselda didn't just disrupt the existing order, she obliterated it. She set up her new headquarters in a modest home in the suburb of Kendall, an area filled with families who had no idea the woman living on the corner was importing more cocaine than anyone else in the city. Her house was equipped with multiple phones, heavily armed guards, and revolving door of couriers who came and went at all hours. Her sons played in the yard while hit men discussed murders in the kitchen. It was a surreal blend of domestic normalcy and organized chaos. Miami police officers remember the first waves of narcotic violence like a series of explosions. Bodies began appearing in alleys in cars in broad daylight, often killed with a precision that suggested military training. Witnesses would hear the roar of motorcycles, the signature calling card of Griselda's sicarios. She had invented a new method of killing: 2 men on a motorcycle. One to drive, one to shoot, pull up beside the target, pull the trigger, vanish into traffic. Efficient, cold, unstoppable. One of her former hitmen, speaking anonymously years later, described the method with chilling simplicity. She wanted deaths that sent messages, he said. Fast, public, unquestionable. She wanted the city to know who owned it. In 1979, the Dadeland Mall shooting changed Miami forever. 2 assassins walked into a liquor store at the mall, carrying machine guns, and unleashed a torrent of bullets targeting rivals of Griselda. Shoppers dove for cover, glass shattered, alarms blared. By the time police arrived, the gunmen were gone, leaving behind a war zone inside a suburban shopping center. News reporters called it the Dadeland Massacre. It was the moment Miami realized the drug war had moved into the daylight. That same night, in a dimly lit living room, Griselda sat in her armchair, sipping whiskey. One of her lieutenants entered nervously. "It's on the news," he said, hands shaking. "They're talking about Colombian cartels." She didn't look away from the television. "Good. Let them talk. But they'll come after us harder now." She smiled faintly. "Then we will hit harder." Miami fell into a rhythm of chaos. Coffins filled. Police sirens became the soundtrack of the city. Reporters called it the cocaine cowboy era, but behind the flashy headlines lay a reality far more brutal. Griselda controlled her organization through terror. Anyone who crossed her paid the price. Some were killed. Some disappeared. Some were tortured. No one was spared, not even her lovers. She was known to use children as shields for drug shipments, mothers as couriers, friends as pawns. Compassion was a tool she did not possess. One afternoon, Griselda suspected one of her dealers of stealing from her. She invited him to a birthday party at her house. Children played, music played, the smell of roasted pork filled the air. When the moment felt right, she called the dealer over. "Come sit," she said calmly. "We need to talk." The man hesitated. Sweat beaded on his forehead. But he sat. Without warning, she pulled a gun from under the table and shot him twice in the head. The children froze. Adults screamed. Her sons watched silently. She set the gun down, wiped her hands, and took a sip of soda. "Clean this up," she ordered her men. This was life under La Madrina. The DEA, meanwhile, had finally put a name to the mysterious woman they'd tracked for years. Agents pieced together fragments from informants, intercepted phone calls, and couriers caught at airports. They couldn't believe it at first. A woman was running one of the most violent, profitable drug operations in the country. Agent Bill Jensen, the same man who'd once seen her in Queens without recognizing her, was now part of the task force hunting her. She wasn't just another trafficker, he later said. She was a ghost with a body count. The DEA called her the Godmother. Miami newspapers called her the Black Widow, referencing rumors that 2 of her husbands had died under suspicious circumstances. Neither nickname fully captured her complexity. Behind the violence was a woman scarred by her past, shaped by poverty, hardened by betrayal. She trusted no one, not even herself. She used religion as a strange anchor, praying before murders, lighting candles before shipments, whispering verses from scripture after interrogations. People who worked closely with her said she cried sometimes, always alone, always silently. But the world never saw those moments. The world only saw the terror she unleashed. In 1981, her relationship with Alberto Bravo dissolved amid accusations that he was stealing money from her. They met in a parking lot in Bogota to argue. Witnesses recalled hearing gunshots echo through the night. Alberto died with multiple bullets in his chest. Griselda walked away wounded but alive. She returned to Miami with a renewed ruthlessness. But while her empire expanded, her personal life decayed. Her sons grew increasingly involved in her business, exposed to violence from childhood. One of them, Dixon, once asked her why she had to hurt so many people. She looked at him with tired eyes. "Because the world hurt me first." Those words would haunt him for years. By the early 1980s, she was importing thousands of kilos of cocaine a year, making hundreds of millions. Her wealth became surreal, a paradox to the woman who had grown up hungry. She bought mansions, cars, jewelry. But she also bought fear. Fear kept her alive. And yet, something began to shift. Her violence became more reckless. She spent more time drunk. She made mistakes. She alienated allies. She developed a dependence on cocaine, mixing paranoia with aggression. Even her own hitmen whispered that she was losing control. One night, while sitting at her dining table surrounded by paperwork, weapons, and empty bottles, she muttered to herself, "Everyone wants to betray me." Her voice cracked. Everyone. Her paranoia was right. Someone was betraying her. A former associate named Jorge Rivi Ayala had been caught and flipped by the DEA. He knew her secrets. He knew her operations. He knew where the bodies were buried, literally. Rivi told the DEA what they suspected but couldn't prove. Griselda had ordered hundreds of killings. He described meetings, methods, conversations. One particularly chilling moment from his testimony recounted a night when Griselda was irritated that a hitman had failed to kill a target. The man had survived, though badly wounded. "I want him finished," she said sharply. "Si, Madrina," Rivi replied. "And do it in front of his family, so they understand." Years later, Rivi said those words still echoed in his mind. "She didn't kill for business," he said. "She killed for emphasis." The DEA built their case methodically. Wiretaps, informants, surveillance. Step by step, they closed in. But Griselda remained elusive until the day she made a mistake too big to outrun. On February 17, 1985, DEA agents surrounded a small house in Irvine, California, where she was hiding under a false identity. She was asleep when they entered. Guns drawn. No resistance. No fight. La Madrina, the woman who'd orchestrated so much death, was arrested in bed, wearing a nightgown. One agent who was present said, "She didn't look like a queen pin. She looked like someone's tired grandmother." But appearances meant nothing. The queen had fallen. As they escorted her outside, Griselda turned to Agent Jensen and said in a quiet voice, "You finally caught me." He nodded. "We did." She smiled faintly. "I was getting bored anyway." Griselda's arrest shocked Miami's underworld. The woman many believed untouchable was suddenly behind bars, facing decades in prison. But even in captivity, she remained a presence, an echo of violence that lingered in the places she once ruled. Her trial became a spectacle. Prosecutors painted her as a monster who had orchestrated a reign of terror, importing mountains of cocaine and leaving trails of bodies in her wake. Defense attorneys tried to humanize her, citing poverty, trauma, and survival instinct. Neither side told the full truth. The full truth was more complicated than any courtroom could contain. Witnesses took the stand trembling. Former associates, former friends, former lovers. Many were already inmates wearing orange jumpsuits, chained at the wrists and ankles. They spoke of murders ordered over the slightest disrespect, of deals made in blood, of a woman who smiled during executions. But Griselda herself remained calm. She wore oversized glasses, neatly pressed clothing, and an expression that revealed nothing. She leaned back in her chair as witnesses described atrocities she had allegedly ordered. At one point, a former hitman said she once shot a woman for offending her at a party. Griselda raised an eyebrow. "That is not true," she whispered to her lawyer. But she did not testify. The courtroom grew accustomed to the tension around her, the silence she carried like a weapon. Reporters tried to decipher her. Psychologists speculated about her. Miami residents watched on television, relieved she was finally being held accountable. She was sentenced to over a decade in federal prison. Additional murder charges were brought later, but those cases collapsed due to a scandal involving a corrupt secretary in the Miami-Dade prosecutor's office. She had been illegally contacting Rivi Ayala, one of the star witnesses. Because of those improprieties, prosecutors had no choice but to drop the murder charges. It was a stunning twist. The godmother had escaped the death penalty or life imprisonment not through cunning, but through the incompetence of others. Still, she remained incarcerated, aging behind bars as her sons, leaders in her former empire, began dying one by one. 2 were killed in Colombia during cartel conflicts. The third disappeared from public life entirely, living under assumed identities. Griselda received the news of each death with a strange quiet. One guard recalled walking past her cell the day she learned about Dixon. She was sitting on her bunk, hands clasped, head bowed. The guard asked gently, "Are you okay?" She didn't look up. A mother should die before her children. It was the closest she ever came to expressing sorrow. Prisoners who lived near her said she kept to herself. She read the Bible daily. She prayed often. She offered advice to young inmates, but never shared details about her past. Some called her Abuela. Others avoided her entirely, sensing the weight of her history. Years later, one inmate said she walked like someone who had lived many lives and was tired of all of them. After serving nearly 20 years in U.S. federal prisons, Griselda was unexpectedly released in 2004 and deported back to Colombia. She was 61 years old. Her power was gone. Her empire dismantled. Her sons dead. She returned to Medellín, a city transformed, modernized, unrecognizable from the world she had left. People in Colombia whispered about her return. Some feared she would rise again. Others believed she was harmless now, a relic of an era long gone. Griselda moved quietly, living under a low profile. She attended church regularly. She lived modestly. Some neighbors claimed she was kind, offering advice to troubled youth. Others insisted she remained dangerous, a coiled snake pretending to sleep. But time is undefeated. On September 3, 2012, Griselda Blanco visited a butcher shop in Medellín. The street was busy, sunlight reflecting off windows, vendors shouting over the sounds of traffic. A motorcycle pulled up beside her, 2 men, just like the method she had invented decades earlier. The passenger stepped off, walked calmly toward her, and shot her twice in the head. He then returned to the motorcycle and disappeared into the city's maze of streets. Witnesses stood frozen, horrified yet unsurprised. The Cocaine Godmother had been killed by her own creation. Her body fell beside bags of meat, her blood pooling across the floor. No ceremony, no final words, no grand finale, just a sudden end, delivered with the same precision she had once demanded of her assassins. When the news broke, people responded with a mix of fear, fascination, and relief. In Miami, old detectives who had chased her for decades shook their heads. Agent Jensen, long retired, said to a reporter her story was never going to end peacefully. In Medellín, the old generation whispered prayers. The younger generation asked who she was. The world had moved on. Her violence belonged to a different era. But history remembered. Her legacy was one of blood and ambition, pain and power. A woman who rose from the slums to rule an empire of death. A woman who showed the world that brutality had no gender. A woman who lived by the gun and died by it. And yet, behind all the headlines and legends, she was still human. A child shaped by pain, a mother shaped by loss, a queen shaped by fear. Her story was not about drugs. It was about survival. And the cost of surviving a world that shows no mercy. Reclaimed her. The narrow alleys of Medellín, the same ones that once echoed with her childhood footsteps, became the place where her story closed. No coronation, no forgiveness, just a quiet street, a motorcycle, and a final breath slipping into the afternoon air. And maybe that is the truth we never want to face about power. It never lasts. It never loves you back. It only borrows your soul for a while, long enough to reshape you into something unrecognizable. Griselda Blanco built an empire out of fear because fear was the only currency she was ever taught to count. She raised sons in the shadow of violence because violence was the only language she believed the world could hear. She carved her name into history not with ink, but with the lives of those who crossed her path. A legacy not written, but whispered like a warning. And yet, in her final years, she sought the quiet she had never known. She sat in church pews, whispering prayers to a God she believed had abandoned her long ago. Maybe she prayed for redemption. Maybe she prayed for her sons. Maybe she simply prayed to be forgotten. But history does not forget people like her. It remembers the imbalance, the damage, the way a single life can warp the trajectory of thousands. It remembers how Miami bled under her rule, how Medellín feared her return, how justice arrived not through courts or prisons, but through a man on a motorcycle who rode away without looking back. And somewhere in the space between myth and memory, Griselda still lingers, an echo in a system built to create monsters, then punish them for becoming exactly what it demanded. A ghost woven into the architecture of two cities. A shadow cast across a generation. A reminder that the line between victim and villain is thinner than we want to believe. And that every empire built on bones eventually collapses under its own weight.